I'm so happy to be able to join you in this process of launching your campaign for being a charter county. And I noticed in the flyer that it said home rule. Now, a lot of people forget that home rule was the term used everywhere in the world to resist the empire. And in those days, the empire was a British empire. It grew out of a company empire. The first corporation was East India Company, 1600. And it was incorporated so that there could be privatization of profits and socialization of costs. And that carries on till today. The reason your initiative for a charter is so important is because the corporations are constantly writing the charters for their rule, their interests, their monopolies. And it is really time for people to remember that freedom and democracy is defended when people start to write charters. It was in 1906 that Gandhi, who of course was so vital to India's independence movement, but before that, actually, he had spent 30 years in Africa, South Africa. And he was on the ship from England to South Africa. And he wrote a little book on freedom. Its subtitle was Home Rule. When people ask me what's a book that has inspired me more, it's really tiny. And he first wrote it in his mother tongue, Gujarati, and then translated it. And it's question and answers. That's all it is. And it's questions about some very, very basic things. And he's, of course, thinking ahead and saying, when India will be free, will she maintain the structures and systems of colonization? And he's saying, no, she can't be free if the structures of enslavement continue. So to be truly free, you must have home rule. But he defined home rule not just as brown skins replacing the British. He defined it as Swaraj. Swa means self, Raj means rule, governance. So for him, self-rule was every person governing themselves. Now, you can't govern yourself unless the values that allow you to live in alignment with the planet, the earth, social justice, human rights, democracy are within you. Because so much of what has colonized us comes from the idea of external control. GMOs are based on the idea of external manipulation. Industrial farming is based on the idea of external inputs, of chemical fertilizers, synthetic pesticides, Roundup. And the assumption is the poor plant doesn't know what to do with itself. And the soil is an empty container, waiting for chemical fertilizers to be doused on it. You know, when I did my study on agriculture in Punjab and what had gone wrong in 1984 when we had the rise of extremism, I read every textbook. There is a feedback, and I'll have to switch this one off. Yeah? Are you sure it's all right? Yeah. Okay.
You can move the mic closer to your mouth. There you go.
Thank you. So 1984, Punjab had erupted in violence. It was the land where industrial chemical agriculture was first applied in the third world. It was called the Green Revolution. Not green, not revolutionary. Because how can transporting war tools and technologies into the way we produce our food be revolutionary? Nothing is more regressive than bringing war to our farms and our kitchens. So I read every book that was taught for industrial chemical farming. Plants were factories, and they ran on the fuel of chemical fertilizers. Soil was an empty container into which we could pour chemical fertilizers. No, plants are not factories, they are self-organized complexity in life. And that's where self-rule, home rule, local democracy as self-governance, as political freedom, and the ability of life to organize itself as ecological freedom have the same principles. And of course, this works all the way from the tiniest of cells and the tiniest of microbes to the individual species and the organism, to an ecosystem, to regions, to the entire planet, which scientists now call Gaia, inspired by the Greek goddess Gaia, because there's no word in modern science which could communicate the self-organizing Earth, a planet which is constantly maintaining its temperature, creating conditions for life to emerge and be maintained. And that's what we are disrupting, except that because the planet is self-organized, she'll find another level. The Earth survived ice ages, she'll survive warming. It's just that we won't belong then. Yeah? And of course, there is a hubris, there's a huge, huge arrogance, which is reflected in the idea of genetic engineering, and it's reflected in the idea of geoengineering. Now engineer the planet. We messed it up. Rather than stopping the pollution, you create artificial volcanoes. President Bush had a favorite experiment, which didn't go through, but the experiment was to put reflectors in the sky to send back the sunlight as if the sun was the problem, rather than realize the sun is a blessing and the pollution is the problem. And in fact, I work on climate change, but I don't talk only about climate change, because climate change is a residual impact of irresponsible human action. You talk about the irresponsible human action rather than create an isolated phenomena out of the impact. Because if you isolate it, and then you're going to be tinkering with it, you're going to do geoengineering, because it's a phenomena that exists outside of human action. And the reason I've made this extra effort to join you is because here in your local community, you're taking every step that it takes to care for this beautiful planet, beginning with the local. Now, we've had globalization and free trade. In fact, the first free trade agreement is not the World Trade Organization. The first free trade agreement is what was written as an agreement, literally with a bribe, by the East India Company and a falling Mughal empire. I think it was a 500 rupee bribe, which in today's currency would be $10. They bribed a clerk and got a signature. And the treaty is called the Free Trade Treaty between the Right Honorable East India Company and Farrukhshir. And it did exactly what current free trade treaties do: tax the local, make the global tax-free, privilege at every point the global, so that the local is punished. There was this lovely song being sung about a little town. And by the way, you know, till I arrived here, I was calling your place Mendocino County. Only because I worked so long, working with presidents of Tuscany, and now we have my colleague Ruchi somewhere in the audience, and the Italians turn every C into ch. So for me, this was Mendocino County. So now I'm trying very hard to not say Mendocino,
It's okay.
It's okay, even if I make it ch.
Keep it going.
And that's, a dollar store? How can anything be a dollar in today's world? Even the fossil fuel they use to transport stuff from China costs more. So we've got this big globalized economy called free trade, and there's nothing free about it except for corporations. And a lot of my friends and colleagues say, oh, we can't use the word free because it's associated with free trade. I said, just because they've tried to hijack our most precious word, freedom, we have to reclaim it. And that's what you're doing with your charter initiative. So of course, for the giant corporations, it makes very, very good sense to go to a big government and get a global law passed or a national law passed. Because they're not going to go to 5,000 counties and come on their knees and beg you to accept their rule. Because you tell them, no, sorry, we know how to live better. So these laws that allow the illusion that seed is an invention of the chemical poison companies, is therefore their property, and they can take a patent on it and collect royalties on it, that law is called the Intellectual Property Rights Law of the World Trade Organization. It has a T before it now because my government, Indian government, with whom I've worked very closely in those days, we said, but intellectual property rights, first of all, things like life are not intellectual property. Life doesn't pop out of anyone's head. Because the definition of intellectual property is property in a product of the mind. A seed does not pop out of Monsanto's head, which doesn't have a head anyway. Yeah, Monsanto is a piece of legal paper. We gave, corporate charters gave them permission to exist. Now they want to be persons. Now they're claiming they're persons. But they don't have heads. They don't have bodies. So a lot of people say, do you hate Monsanto? I said, no. I can't hate a non-existing entity. And in fact, if Monsanto was a person, I'd give them a hug and just tell them how wrong they are in everything they do, but they're not a person. They're not a person. And it's this, separation between the fact that there are people who make huge money by being part of Monsanto, including the shareholders, and yet the corporation is different from them. And this is where the East India Company, as a limited liability corporation, it begins this track. Take the profits, shed the responsibility. And it's so clear in the way the GMO issue was brought and imposed on the world. And that's why in every place where people care for freedom, they're saying, we don't want GMOs. Somewhere they do it by just growing the alternative stronger. Somewhere they do it like you, by getting a GMO-free decision passed at the county level. So the law on intellectual property, literally a Monsanto representative said, we did something unprecedented. We wrote a law, took it to our government, imposed it on the world. That's what they say about intellectual property in seed. That they wrote the law. They say that we were the patient, the diagnostician, and the physician all in one. As a patient, their sickness was that people save seeds. That's why they were sick. Their solution was it should now be made illegal. Seed saving should be made illegal. And I was at a meeting, 1987, where the biotech industry was working out its strategic plans, and they really had thought by year 2000, all seed would be genetically modified. Most seed isn't. And by the time our freedom movements have completed their task, we will have rendered genetic engineering where it belongs in the garbage of history. Because the first false claim is we've invented the seed. The second false claim is we have a right to a monopoly on the seed because we are bringing better seeds. Why do people fight against GMOs if they were better seeds? Everyone knows that all that genetic engineering has achieved in all of these years is putting two toxic traits into our food. A Bt toxin, which is toxin, the name tells you, and herbicide resistance, which is a toxin which also allows more spraying of another toxin, the Roundup and the glyphosate. And antibiotic resistance markers and viral promoters. It is such a clumsy technology. Interestingly, there's a particular scientist called Dr. Folter, and you might have seen in the New York Times yesterday, there was an article and emails have been released